I'm thrilled today to welcome Paige Glotzer to present in DemSem. So Dr. Glotzer is an assistant professor in history here at the University of Wisconsin, but she's actually joining us from Florida today. So we're in some senses, we're racing the hurricane to make sure that sort of her signal sticks together. So if the sound goes out a little bit, you might hear me interrupting just to give Dr. Glotzer a cue to sort of try to adapt to how things are going. But so Paige Glotzer is currently the John W. and Jean Rao Chair for History and American Politics, Institutions, and Political Economy here at Wisconsin. She earned her PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University, after which she spent 2 years at Harvard as the Prize Fellow in Economics, History, and Politics at the Joint Center for Economics and History. Her book, How the Suburbs Were Segregated, traces the history of how suburban developers constructed discriminatory housing markets between the 1890s and the 1960s, and has been recognized with multiple book awards since it was released. She's asked that we hold our questions until the end of her presentation. And so with that, we're really happy that you're joining us today, and I look forward to hearing your talk, Dr. Glotzer.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Monica, Mary Lynn, and I'm really happy to get the chance to talk with everyone today. So I'll get started. I don't think it's surprising to anyone here to say that American cities tend to be racially segregated. Neighborhoods are mostly Black or white, for example, and majority white neighborhoods tend to be wealthier, the buildings in better shape, and they receive more city services. Meanwhile, suburbs, which are some of the biggest examples of historically white areas in the United States, for reasons I'll be discussing today, have also been disproportionately wealthy and recipients of services relative to non-white areas of cities. My research looks at why, and two questions drive my work. How do we account for pervasive housing segregation? And why does it assume certain forms and not others? I argue that the answers lie with the way some of the earliest suburban developers experimented with racial segregation as a tactic to increase sales at the turn of the 20th century. They then disseminated those practices, standardized them through associations, and helped federal policymakers codify these practices into discriminatory federal housing policy, especially during the 1930s and 40s, but not exclusively during the 1930s and 40s. So those of you who are familiar with the history of American suburbs might think of them as a post-World War II phenomenon, but developers actually laid the groundwork for post-war housing discrimination long before. So I actually began in the 1890s. And like any historian, I have to give the caveat that, of course, you could go back earlier than that. There are certainly intellectual, political, and legal precedents that inform those events in the 1890s. But it was that decade where some of the realtors who played crucial roles in the creation of mid-20th century federal housing policies began to gain a disproportionately large platform to shape the national housing market. And these federal policies are the ones that historians and I imagine scholars in many other disciplines use to account for both the rise of large segregated metropolitan areas and also a white consumer base that was, and in many instances still is, willing to defend housing segregation. So in my talk today, I'll be highlighting the history of one developer based in Baltimore, Maryland, called the Roland Park Company. But I won't be sticking to them. Beginning in 1891, the company developed over 2,500 acres in northern Baltimore, and its officers played key roles in the processes I just mentioned, disseminating practices, standardizing them through associations, and working with federal policymakers. So I tend to think of my work as a case study in some ways, but also a look at a network of realtors, planners, and policymakers. So I'll start the talk by discussing the origins of the Roland Park Company and look at how its finances, in part, shape the decisions of its managers to turn to racial segregation. And then after that, I'll illustrate some of the ways that the company experimented with planning, design, and sales tactics that gave particular unprecedented shape to how housing segregation worked. And then I'll look at the processes by which they disseminated, standardized them, and finally help turn suburban housing segregation into enduring policy. So the reason why I want to start with the finances is because already I think that by looking at the Roland Park Company finances, we start to potentially cast housing segregation in the United States in a bit of a different light. So the Roland Park Company, which was based in Baltimore, Maryland, actually was financed by over 400 British investors in the 1890s. And this was everyone from mustard manufacturers to priests to school teachers. There's actually a long history of small British investments in what we might call colonial activities and the finances of colonialism in places like India or Egypt or in the Caribbean. But in the 1890s, it was easier than ever for more and more British people to invest. So why Baltimore and why housing? Well, one hint that I found in the archives was that the particular company that was channeling this money to the Roland Park Company, it was a British financial company called the Lands Trust Company. And they had an ad. And this ad said that investing with them would bring their capital to, quote, lands in those more newly settled parts of the United States or in the colonies, where from the influx of population, they are rapidly enhancing in value, end quote. So in terms of how these British investors conceived of Baltimore, it actually fit really well into existing conceptions of colonial land speculation. And that idea that there would somehow be empty land and that the presence of new suburbanites, in which case white suburbanites, would make it increase in value, is also kind of an echo of the idea that there is a type of erasure that was taking place with this investment and a fiction that there was empty land, even though land was already occupied and settled in Baltimore and in elsewhere. But Baltimore also had some other characteristics that make it really important in the history of housing at that time. So first, believe it or not, in 1890, Baltimore was the 6th largest city in the United States. And it was the site of migration, immigration, and industrialization. So native-born white people, especially white elites, were responding to some of these processes by moving to the periphery, often using discourses about health and the need to get away from unhealthy bodies or unhealthy situation, or unhealthy sanitary situations. And at the same time, there were large what were called country estates, but were actually, and many times, former plantations that had been worked by enslaved laborers. And they were being sold off by the descendants of Confederate sympathizers because they were no longer really kind of profitable or financially viable to hold. So the periphery that white Baltimoreans sort of had in mind were essentially former areas worked by enslaved labor. And these country estates essentially had some also similarities in terms of topography and environment. So the scholar Carl Nightingale actually compares these country estates in Baltimore to British colonial hill stations in India and in Africa, because they were actually at the top of pretty high hills in Baltimore. Baltimore goes down to the harbor, so the further away you get from the center of Baltimore, the higher the elevation. And one of the first things that the Roland Park Company ended up doing was displacing a long-standing Black population from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill, to an area that would have been considered potentially worse off in terms of its health conditions. So aside from these similarities, though, and this is where that network piece starts to become, I think, important, Baltimore was only one stop for this British capital. And I'm just going to put a quick link to a digital project I did where you can kind of interact with some of this data. But these are screenshots that you're seeing. They're actually from some of the data that I use. So I'll just hang on for that for a second. So I would say that suburbs in the United States, just to kind of to tie this together, they need to be understood in a larger worldwide context in the 1890s. And a worldwide context that also includes a longer history of the making of race, empire, and cities. And I would say that we can see that longer history when actually looking at where some of the main investors in suburban housing segregation in Baltimore had actually obtained the money that they invested. So I follow the money both before and after it was used in Baltimore. For some of those investors, it was the only investment they made in their lifetimes. But for the most active members, it was actually part of a long line of investments. And so I put two here, people named Alfred Fryer and Jacob Bright, both British, actually both Quakers, which was a religious connection I never quite solved in terms of doing this project, that there was a heavy Quaker presence in the investment. And anyway, they invested their money all over the world, including in the Congo, in India, in Egypt, and also in places that were fueling white settlement in the American West in the 1880s and 1890s, some with direct connections to Native American genocide and to federal military sites as well. So that's the context for housing, for why the finances, I think, matter for understanding the origins of suburban housing segregation. There's a global story there that you can look at through money investment. But how does that actually get us to the forms of the American suburb and why it took particular types of segregation to run them from the start? Well, these financial imperatives were actually very different from what previous Baltimore builders had. This type of transnational investment was supposed to be long-term investment, rather than previous ways of building, especially in cities like Baltimore, that were very short-term. So people tried to build, say, a couple of row houses and get out before certain financial obligations became due. The Roland Park Company needed to sustain longer-term involvement with this land in order to guarantee returns for their investors year after year. So what they did then was they kind of looked around as they understood racial geography, as they understood their business and their context in the United States at that time during the rise of Jim Crow. And they turned to two things. They turned to deed restrictions and to planning as ways to control their tract, which they named Roland Park. Deed restrictions are actually more well known by the name restrictive covenants. There are some slight legal differences, but for the purposes of this talk, they really are the same. So restrictive covenants, what are they? Restrictive covenants were community-wide sets of rules that were legally binding for every property owner in an area. And their purpose could be, for instance, aesthetic. It could specify that a house had to be set back from the street, or it had to be made of certain materials, or have certain styles. These are some examples of what you might find in a restrictive covenant. But restrictive covenants are also about social control and social functions. So by setting, for instance, each house back from the street, someone had to be able to afford to buy more land in order to have that house. In order for certain materials to be used, you potentially had to spend more on those materials. So ostensibly, a lot of restrictive covenant clauses that seemed aesthetic, that seemed about the look and feel of Roland Park, were also actually class controls. They were barriers to entry. And so there was a type of class discrimination that connected with these aesthetic controls. But there was more. The Roland Park Company, and this is a lot of text, I'll direct your attention to some of it in a moment. The Roland Park Company instituted one of the first community-wide racial clauses in a restrictive covenant. And in this middle paragraph, it says that at no time shall the land included in said tract, or any part thereof, or any building erected thereon, be occupied by any, and they use the polite term for Black person in the 1890s, Negro, or person of Negro extraction, they say, and I'll paraphrase, this doesn't apply to domestic servants. So essentially, you could not own property or live in property if you were Black unless you were a servant employed by a white homeowner. This was also placed and in a part of the restrictive covenants that I think is also very telling. It comes after a prohibition on livestock and right before a prohibition on using excess smoke. So essentially, this didn't receive its own separate part of the restrictive covenants and is lumped in. Essentially, Black people are placed in the same type of categories as animals and smoke. So I think that already you can kind of start to get a sense of the way that race is sort of functioning within the actual official controls, the legally binding controls of Roland Park. Now, racial segregation in housing was absolutely nothing new. In fact, I wanted to do research on where did the Roland Park Company even get this wording? And they ended up getting it from their sanitary engineer, the guy who made their sewers, who had been doing projects all over the country, including in the South, and also as well from from one or two different mayors as well. So they wrote very widely to people asking for this. And in the end, though, this was one of the first community-wide restrictive covenants in the US to include a racial clause. There was some question about whether this was legal or acceptable. And this is one thing that actually brought me to this project, which was I found a letter between the general manager of the Roland Park Company, his name is Edward Boughton, and the company's lawyers in 1893, asking whether it would be legal to put this type of racial clause into the covenants in Maryland. And one thing that really shocked me was the lawyer said, absolutely not. You cannot do this. This is completely illegal. This would actually be an embarrassment, especially in the state of Maryland, which has one of the largest Black populations in the country. So this was a moment, this was an inflection point where clearly there was not enough of a precedent for the Roland Park Company to be like, we can do this without seeking consultation. And the lawyer, who was a very prominent white lawyer, was adamant that this was not acceptable. And yet the Roland Park Company, they waited a couple of years. They had some restrictive covenants that didn't have the racial clause, and then they put it in. And after they put it in, it stayed in for the rest of their time, the next 50 years, the rest of their time in business. So for me, this kind of signals that there was not essentially a straight line or sort of essentially segregation to desegregation. In fact, the 1890s was a moment where you see new forms of housing segregation being put in place that weren't there even just potentially a few years before. So there's more of a jagged line in terms of looking at the history of things like segregation in housing. But in addition to these restrictive covenants, the Roland Park Company turned to planning as a way to signal to not only its investors, but also to its buyers that it was exclusive and that they could control the tract long term. So I'm going to show you now a series of slides concerning the second community built by the Roland Park Company called Guilford. So this is Guilford, I outlined with red, and this is actually a modern day map because the boundaries of Guilford have largely not changed since 1912, which is when Guilford was opened. So I was able to actually just take a screenshot of a modern map and give you the boundaries of Guilford. You'll notice Johns Hopkins University is right next to Guilford. Roland Park is just north of Guilford. So this is Guilford, and I want to draw your attention to this street here. This is the eastern boundary of Guilford. On the map, it says Greenmount Avenue. The street actually has two names, Greenmount Avenue and York Road. You'll probably hear me say York Road most of the time. So this is York Road. Notice the lack of through streets. between Guilford and the area east of York Road. The area east of York Road was already built up. It was a mixed race, mixed class area in Baltimore, and it included affluent African Americans as well. So there was a lack of through streets that would get people in and out of Guilford to that area across York Road. The Roland Park Company also built a wall. They built a 14-foot high wall separating Guilford from York Road itself. And that wall is still there, and that is a picture that I took. So it's still functioning. But also, even in the way that the houses along the edge of Guilford were designed, you can see an intent at creating a type of boundary to cut Guilford off from this mixed race and mixed class area. So the houses in this design were, for the edge of Guilford, either faced inward, meaning they didn't face York Road directly, or they were set back a bit from York Road to create a kind of sense of spatial separation. And there was a combination, and they were attached, whereas most of the houses in Guilford were detached single-family homes. Now, these were what the company marketed as Guilford's smallest, cheapest houses, though they were by no means small or cheap by the standards of the day. But when you put them all together, they also created a bit of a de facto wall. You couldn't even see through gaps in the attached houses. So it was an extension in some ways of the actual wall. And when you put all of them together, the wall, the disconnected streets, the small attached houses, you see that for over a mile, the Roland Park Company essentially created a continuous boundary cutting off Guilford from areas to the east. This was done with intent. So in correspondence of the Roland Park Company, I found that this was, in the words of Boughton, the general manager, to protect Guilford from quote unquote eyesores that would be surrounding the area east of York Road. And by eyesores, he meant both people as well as physical structures. Now, I had mentioned that we can see a longer history of empire following the money that financed the Roland Park Company. We can also see that history at work with the company's planning. Guilford's boundaries were, and its streets in general, were laid out by a landscape architecture firm called the Olmsted Brothers. The Olmsted Brothers were the sons of Frederick Law Olmsted, known for doing things like New York Central Park and for playing a large role in the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. The Olmsteds actually took commissions around the world, and so including in territory that the United States disputed with Cuba, and occupied, and now belongs to Cuba, where they created a community for expats, complete with a similar street pattern to Guilford, as well as some features that they also helped with the Roland Park Company. So they helped to design a country club. Roland Park Company had a country club, and also a whole set of boundaries, including gates, fences, and smaller attached types of houses along the edges. So you see this being kind of taken and translated internationally to sites that the United States was trying to essentially incorporate territorially as its own. Now, that longer history, however, also informs some of the ways that the Roland Park Company and its peers, because the Roland Park Company also started to write letters to other developers, share practices, which I'll get into more in a moment, is how they started to actually think about their relationship with municipal governments. So one thing that I do in the book is I look at the way that developers help to shift municipal political processes at the turn of the century in order to secure resources for their developments. So when the Roland Park Company needed things such as an extension of Baltimore's sewer system, they actually only needed one petition to get that done, where even though, and I talk about, they didn't from an actual health or sanitary or even just sewage standpoint need that, but they still got it Whereas there were other areas of Baltimore that were plagued by epidemics, had undrinkable water, that were poorly engineered in terms of their streets. It sometimes took over 100 petitions from coming out of a poor immigrant neighborhood to get a single pipe laid. So there was an uneven response from Baltimore City to the Roland Park Company than to areas that actually were more in need of some of its services. But the Roland Park Company and the city were doing things that created linkages, such as they were both creating master plans. So the Roland Park Company was a type of developer that was creating long-term plans. The city was creating long-term master plans for things like its sewage system, and they shared resources, they shared personnel. The Olmsted brothers worked on Baltimore's park system as well during this time. So this essentially created an uneven way in which suburban developers started to obtain more types of a more responsive ear from city government. And sewers really are a means by which you can trace that. The delivery of sewage, the circulation of sewers was always a way you can trace environmental inequality, but also the way in which developers were able to hoard resources and shift the priorities of city policymaking through infrastructure. Now, there are some other linkages, though, that I want to discuss in terms of this longer history of housing segregation. The Roland Park Company started to correspond, as I mentioned, very, very widely with developers, also though with other city planners, with city governments around the country. And it was because in part that city planners, again, shared some of the priorities and tasks that they saw suburban developers doing in what was ostensibly a private capacity. So you see a kind of blurry line in terms of the actions that sort of form part of suburban development with what formed part of the early days of urban planning. And this was a way in which you start to see the circulation of the tools of segregation. So the Roland Park Company fielded requests for copies of its restrictive covenants. And then those were requests, again, from public as well as private officials. One example of kind of concretely tracing the circulation of restrictive covenants through public and private means was through John Nolan, a planner who actually has a very heavy influence in the city of Madison. Nolan, who was a city planner who also dabbled in real estate development, requested a copy of the Roland Park Company's restrictive covenants, crossed out Roland Park Company, and just started filling in other names of places in it, taking it wholesale, lifting it wholesale, and adapting it to the conditions that he thought would they be best suited for at the time. Nolan was not the only one who did this. Another person who requested a copy of the deed restrictions or the restrictive covenants was someone named John Burdett Ford, who taught one of the first standardized courses on city planning at an American university, in this case, Columbia, where restrictive covenants formed as part of the curriculum. And the Roland Park Company's covenants were used in classes. The Olmsted brothers, too, helped to adapt the language of restrictive covenants as they started to take on different commissions from other developers across the country who were trying to create bigger and bigger planned suburbs in the decades after the Roland Park Company and some of the really early developers that were their contemporaries had some success. So, for example, they adapted the restrictive covenant of Palos Verdes Estates in California to prohibit Mexican occupancy. So that kind of local racial geography was a product also of a national circulation of restrictive covenants. The circulation of covenants changed the ways that cities were organized as well. So one place that covenants really laid the groundwork for were early zoning laws. So one thing that city planners in the 1910s and 20s especially were finding very appealing about suburbs was that they separated uses. That you can have streets that were, because of the restrictive covenants, designated as residential streets. You couldn't have, say, a factory on a street in Guilford because restrictive covenants prohibited anything except residential uses. So this was the basis for some of the initial zoning laws in the United States that split cities into areas and designated them for, say, mainly residential use or commercial use or industrial use. And zoning laws took on, they kind of formed a wave of legislation in the 1910s and 20s. But Baltimore tried an experiment in racial zoning laws as well. So throughout the 1910s, in response to fears that Baltimore's elite were going to leave some of the older, wealthier neighborhoods behind and move to Roland Park, and that, you know, shock, horror, African Americans and Jewish people might move in instead. There was an organized movement among wealthy property owners to get the city to divide the city into white blocks and black blocks and prescribe things like arrest and fines if people moved into a block not designated for their race. And this was only enforced against Black people trying to move into blocks that had been designated as white. That was eventually struck down by the Supreme Court because there had been copycats of it all across the country. So the NAACP, including some very prominent Black lawyers in Baltimore, helped to eventually get that declared unconstitutional. But the result of that was that it outlawed zoning laws from being racially, from creating racial inequality because they were public laws. Meanwhile, the restrictive covenants, which were not uses of state power, were absolutely still allowed to essentially do the same thing. So you see not only a rise in ostensibly colorblind use zoning following this case in 1917, which happened to just zone Black neighborhoods industrial more often than not, but you see a rise in restrictive covenants after 1917, after a Supreme Court case, in which essentially you have, and you have the endorsement of, say, like the mayor of Baltimore saying, yes, use more restrictive covenants. Yes, let's kind of get use zoning to achieve our means, even if we can't call it racial zoning. So into the 1920s, you have these two trends, both of which were inspired and directly traceable to developers like the Roland Park Company, essentially reshaping land use in both public and private ways throughout the country, precisely at a time of massive city and suburban growth. But I want to kind of pivot now into how did this become organized and standardized, even though it was clearly there was a lot in circulation and clearly people were talking to each other, reading each other's things, looking to other examples across the country of segregation. How did this become kind of standardized? Well, this involved some of the same people who were very eager to circulate, say, restrictive covenants, like the Roland Park Company, essentially wanting to come together to create a national professional association rather than just informally circulate their things. And this, they came together and they formed the National Association of Realtors, which was then called the National Association of Real Estate Boards. At the time, realtors were not respected by and large. The popular view in America of real estate agents was as swindlers and scam artists. NARIB sought to change that by establishing real estate as a profession, mainly over the 1910s and 20s and into the 1930s. And the reason why something like a restrictive covenant then became important for NARIB was that the most respected, in their minds, the most respected type of real estate agent was a suburban developer, creating the most respectable type of community. So they would help to essentially then their leadership, as the thinking went, their leadership and their support of this professionalization project would do the most to lend an air of respect to real estate via the National Association of Real Estate Boards. So early suburban developers were the association's first leaders and executive boards, and essentially, they served as tastemakers amongst the members of the National Association of Realtors. To get a sense of what they were aiming for, you can look at their image of themselves. So this is from a NARIB convention in Detroit in 1920. So this was the cover of the Detroit kind of publication, the Detroit Realtor. And we can see the ways that realtors were trying to position themselves as upstanding members of a community, as civic leaders. They're wearing classical garb, they have knowledge. It's a white man, although he's a little puny to be wearing a toga, but that's what they did. And essentially, we can see the scenes that realtors thought that they sort of helped to usher in to a place like Detroit. So realtors holding the car, because they are leaders and bringers of progress, helped to create the commercial skyline of Detroit, the active smokestacks, the white industrial workers kind of working at a factory in this image. And then you also see a suburban house with a white husband, wife, and a small child. And the house is set back from the street, and I could have fit right in at Roland Park. So these were the types of upstanding professional practice. These were the images that were supposed to be the best that realtors could do. Now, to back up that kind of understanding of their position within cities and within, in general, larger society, NAREB also adopted a code of ethics in 1924. And this adopting code of ethics was a kind of common move amongst professional associations when they're formed. But also it was another way of trying to standardize real estate that would show that there was a standard body of knowledge, that there was a profession, and that realtors were leaders in the community and wouldn't do harm to it. So this was the code of ethics. Part of this code of ethics prohibited realtors from, quote, introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individual whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. This is an explicit articulation that connects the characteristics of people, race or nationality, with property value, and also with uses, right? Any character of property or occupancy. So essentially, property value, according to narrow code of ethics, would be harmed if realtors created racially integrated neighborhoods or if realtors mixed uses inappropriately in a neighborhood. This was a continuation of the logic of restrictive covenants that mix together social controls with aesthetic controls and also with uses that are creating residential areas. So for the same reasons that had formed the basis for things like zoning laws, it's now kind of codified into this code of ethics in a way that links race directly to property values going up or down. And it was grounds for expulsion from the association, which was a racially segregated association. I should mention that very clearly. It was grounds for white realtors to be expelled, to lose their license if they showed essentially people who were not white houses in white areas. Realtors deliberately worded this article broadly, and they did devolve wide-ranging discretionary powers in doing so to individual brokers, but they were mandating that all realtors adhered to this, that they were duty-bound to exercise what they called their social responsibility by considering how they were affecting the surrounding area. Now, NAREB had an idea of racial hierarchy that was sort of built into it, and it continued to play out on the ground in local daily business practices. So NAREB was never totalizing in terms of influencing or completely having any type of control over what realtors were actually doing day to day. And one of the reasons why I look at housing segregation on multiple scales, like from the street level up to this national level and beyond. And I quickly want to show how essentially you can see this whole hierarchy, not just like a black-white binary at all, but a whole hierarchy at work. Now, what you're looking at here, and again, as text, but I'll explain. These are two files from the Roland Park Company that they called the exclusion files. These were evidence of the hyperlocal, very daily, and actually very mundane decisions that the salesman of the Roland Park Company had to make every day when deciding who to sell a house to. This was where you can see essentially how they were trying to understand and adhere to kind of notions of racial hierarchy in terms of populating the suburbs. So on both of these, you see that the salesman investigated, essentially. The salesman, I'll walk you through it narratively. A salesman learned somehow that Max Zerndorf, who was a lithographer in Baltimore, was really interested in buying a home. And at first glance, this seemed to be a really good thing for the salesman. And he kind of took a phone call about it. But as he was on the phone, he said, okay, well, I don't like the way this person sounds. This person sounds Jewish, whatever that meant to the salesman at that time. So that meant that he didn't actually ask him for many details about what type of house he wanted to buy. And then he did some type of investigation because there were no legal privacy laws about, confidentiality in this regard, did some type of investigation. This might have been calling relatives, calling the place where he worked, some way associated with lithography business, potentially looking at where he lived on Carlisle Avenue and seeing who the other people were near his home, called him Jewish and wrote Jewish. And then essentially we see another example. So we cut to this. I've also just given you another screenshot. This is from a different exclusion file where someone else was labeled Jewish. And in these cases, the sale would just stop. But one thing I find interesting too is that the one salesman wrote Jewish, another wrote please tell Snyder, meaning just in case this person tries again with a different salesman, you should tell the other salesman too. So there was a kind of notion that there might be some resistance to this as well. And these files were all kept, and sometimes it was not just because people were Jewish. Sometimes this is where you see gender roles being debated and discussed. This is sometimes where the Roland Park Company salesman had to deal with racial hierarchy in unexpected ways, like how to deal with Asian people, which some of them had never dealt with in their lives in a Black and white city like Baltimore. You see this all playing out in the exclusion files, which paint a really messy and sometimes very ambiguous picture about how a lot of different types of individual instances of vetting and sales and discrimination were going on. But I think it's really important to point out, and I have about 100 of these. I can talk about the exclusion files all day with you. But I want to point out one really important distinction here. These were inter-office private documents. These were debated among staff and filed, but these were not public documents like restrictive covenants, meaning that while the Roland Park Company put a blanket tool on banning African Americans from buying and living in its developments, it was not explicit publicly about all the other people who were actually subject to discrimination as well. And those were carried out on a more individual basis, even though there were, say, rules against selling to Jews. This took place on the individual and sometimes private level. So there was always public cause for doubt and plausible deniability about what the Roland Park Company and what suburban developers were potentially doing if they weren't in the restrictive covenants. But this also shows that Black people tended to be at the bottom of the racial hierarchy in terms of thinking about suburban development, that it was essentially everyone was still being vetted relative to kind of, again, this public blanket exclusion that somehow was more socially or politically or culturally and legally possible to put in a document that was filed publicly, a restrictive covenant. Now, ideas then filtered up and down, and they were multi-directional in terms of the ideas around housing segregation. So even though the Roland Park Company used exclusion files and they were private documents, in realtor professional magazines, you would actually see file systems for sale that were made for storing cards just like that on sales prospects that could be used for exclusion files or not. They could just be used for your sales department. Now, I do want to pivot briefly to how this all made it into federal policy. And I want to talk about redlining. This is a Madison redlining map. So when the Great Depression hit, the federal government essentially turned to the National Association of Realtors for guidance and for help, because they successfully had cultivated themselves as experts in the eyes of the federal government to help write the rules around the very first peacetime national housing policies. And that were different attempts to try and essentially create economic recovery through lending, through preventing foreclosure, and through also saving the construction industry, which was in dire straits after during the Great Depression as well. So to this end, the agency that was created, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HULC, essentially helped the federal government by giving it criteria that the federal government would then use to divide up to over 200 cities in the country into areas showing where it might help people whose mortgages were in danger of foreclosure, and where it certainly wouldn't help people whose mortgages were in danger of foreclosure. So in other words, it framed this as a question of risk. You would see redlining talked about in terms of risk for the federal government to help out people who might be about to lose their homes. Now, if an area was green, that meant that they were going to probably help out. And if the area was red, they were most likely not going to help out. But it's the criteria themselves that we see this kind of continuation of essentially these ideas that have their origins in segregated suburban development. Federal administrators looked to restrictive covenants very explicitly, and they also developed ideas about value. So essentially, one reason why they may not want to help out someone who might be losing their mortgage is that what if they, say, bought and refinanced that person's mortgage, and then they said, but the property value declines and after that, well, then we're stuck holding a mortgage that's worthless. So their ideas about what property value was helped make that criteria. Race, religion, class, and essentially anything you can lift out of an exclusion file or restrictive covenant were explicitly used as criteria. And there's actually a wonderful digital project called Mapping Inequality, where you can actually see all of the actual criteria and the ratings the different HULC map consultants and appraisers used when evaluating areas. But suffice it to say that areas that were essentially considered to be primarily African-American, or even a little bit African-American, were usually redlined regardless of any other criteria, meaning that wealthy, affluent Black neighborhoods were likely to be redlined, more likely to be redlined than, let's say, poor, certain types of poor white neighborhoods. But you have a complete conflation within redlined areas about the criteria as well. So segregated suburbs were usually green, places like Shorewood, or places like Maple Bluff. Oops, sorry. But areas that had African Americans or seemed to potentially be open to what they called infiltration HULC, those would be more likely to be redlined. And again, there was some local adaptation in every single city, but we can discuss more. But that's like full stop, not even necessarily a debate, that you can look at the ways that race formed the criteria very explicitly in documents. Now, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, which took over for HULC's mission, essentially extended all of the criteria of redlining maps to the private lending industry. And essentially they provided insurance to back up any private loans, any private mortgages to people, so long as those loans conformed in some ways to this criteria. The FHA proved a boon, especially to suburban developers. And within its first year, the FHA financed about 70% of all Roland Park Company business. Now, quickly, isn't this all illegal now, right? So we're in the 1940s, and 30s, we have redlining, we have mortgage discrimination, explicitly based on race, though also there's a huge conflation between race and all these other things such as aesthetics, uses, class, but it's all mixing up together. But race actually is one of the factors that you can separate out and show that it's working in some ways above and separate from all the other criteria. It's always there, right? Isn't this all illegal now? Well, yes, but. So in 1948, you have a Supreme Court case called Shelley v. Kramer, which ruled that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable, but not illegal, meaning that unless they were explicitly challenged in court on a case-by-case basis, it was still okay to use them. And so developers still took the risk and used it. And so you still had restrictive covenants with racial clauses after 1948, but they did decline a little bit over time from there. The FHA removed explicit racial language from its underwriting manuals, from its lending policies, in response to Shelley v. Kramer. But it actually continued to discriminate in its mortgage insurance as if they hadn't removed that language. So actually the status quo continued there as well. And NAREP revised its code of ethics in 1950 to essentially read something very similar to this, but it said a realtor should not be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or use, which will clearly be detrimental to the property values of the neighborhood. So they took out mentions of race. They kind of streamlined that a bit, but occupancy, living in a house, was a type of use. And so realtors would still be introducing a detrimental use into a neighborhood if they were introducing people of different races into the neighborhood to live in homes. This was another way to actually change language with the intent of preserving the status quo. People still believed that race was tied to property value, regardless of what the Supreme Court said. And they were going to protect that in terms of things like mortgages and real estate transactions to the extent possible. Now, I want to return to York Road. I discussed the boundaries of York Road and mentioned that Guilford was, a very affluent, white, segregated suburb, and the areas to the right of it were mixed race and they were mixed class. If you look at the redlining maps for the same area, Guilford was green. You have York Road as a yellow strip. That's the second worst rating you could get, right? It was green, blue, yellow, red. You have a redlined area. That redlined area was 51% Black at the time that it was redlined. And you have this green section again to the east, but that green section was actually a future Roland Park Company development. They actually hadn't even developed yet. It was just a parcel of land they bought. And on that basis, it received the green rating. There were no houses there yet. So if we look at the city's racial distribution, and I need to update this now that we have the 2020 census out, but York Road is actually one of the starkest racial dividing lines in Baltimore to this day. And I can talk about kind of some of the reasons why in Q&A if people want, but those boundaries all are still there, and you don't even need the street names to find where York Road is in Baltimore. You can also see where York Road is by looking at a foreclosure map from the 2008 housing crisis. It's no coincidence that racial boundaries line up with foreclosures. And looking at a foreclosure map like this one links the way that we talk about segregation and design to the mechanisms of capitalism in general, bringing us back to that investment piece at the very beginning. So because of redlining, African Americans were shut out of essentially getting mortgages on good terms for a very long time. In fact, until fair housing laws in the late 60s that finally made it illegal to discriminate based on race and housing. That, again, didn't actually stop racial discrimination in housing and lending, but it was only illegal in the 1960s. So you still have that period from 1948 Shelley v. Kramer to 1968, where wording was changing, but the status quo wasn't. And 68, it's finally declared illegal, but you still don't actually have an end to discrimination, especially in lending. So what you instead have is you have predatory lending. So leading up to the 2008 housing crisis, you had essentially areas, You had areas where you folks who lived in them for a very long time, for generations, couldn't get mortgages on a good term due to a loosening of some regulations in the 90s, including around subprime mortgages. You have something called reverse redlining, where previously redlined areas were flooded with lending opportunities, but on very bad terms. So suddenly, in the early 2000s, people who had been shut out of the mortgage market for all of the reasons I've been discussing suddenly could get mortgages, but they were really bad predatory mortgages, which made them much more vulnerable to foreclosure when the housing market collapsed, which is why there are correlations between racial distribution in cities and foreclosure maps and where you can pick out York Road. So in short, segregation remains very profitable. And finally, I want to show you a tree map. Trees are municipal resources. So you can also pick out where York Road is on this map just from where the tree density stops, right? And then it picks up again in the east in that newer Roland Park Company development, the one that had earned a green rating, even though it hadn't been developed yet. So you can see this dearth of trees in what is now majority Black neighborhood. And trees, again, are municipal resources like sewers. And so where they are, how they are distributed is a way to look at how discriminatory planning creates and reinforces uneven political power across neighborhoods that affects resource distribution and has all sorts of consequences, especially in this case for trees, for public health. So those are just some of those criteria. And I want to conclude now. I began my talk by saying that most of you would not be surprised that American cities are racially segregated. And likewise, I said it would probably not be surprising that suburbs tend to be wealthier and whiter. But the ascendance of the single family house in the planned segregated suburb to being the most valuable and desirable type of property was not inevitable when the Roland Park Company put down roots in Baltimore at the turn of the 20th century. And since it was not inevitable, we must understand why it persisted decades later. By bringing together discussions of investment, institutions, planning, and policy, I seek to de-essentialize racism while providing a granular analysis of how it became foundational to the ways that housing is valued, imagined, bought, and sold in the 20th century. I concretely trace people, capital, and ideas to examine how certain white developers gained disproportionate influence to shape the rise of a segregated housing market. The key to their success, I argue, was their ability to adapt time and again segregation to bring them profits and prestige. But I also want to raise the caveat that we shouldn't mistake their actions as people twirling their mustaches in the back room. You know, exclusion was actually really quotidian and often more subtle. This, even though it could also be very, very explicit. Exclusion informed the connections between colonial investment and urban growth, daily managerial decisions, the work of building professional institutions, and the mechanisms of government resource distribution. And like we see on the foreclosure map and this tree map, it continues to shape the landscape itself. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. This was really fascinating talk. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. I think in keeping with our sort of past practices, we'd love for the first two questions to come from graduate students, and then we'll open it up to the rest of things. So I encourage you to use the raised hand function to sort of indicate that you have a question that you want to ask. We can, I guess, sort of get things started. There's actually a question in the chat that came in while you were talking that's from one of our graduate students, Michael Zaslowski, and he was asking just for clarification around whether the John Nolan that you mentioned is indeed the John Nolan of John Nolan Drive. And perhaps, I mean, I'm going to build on his question and maybe you could talk a little bit more around his role in things.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is the same John Nolan of John Nolan Drive fame. John Nolan was who he had his hand in many different kind of pots, not just in Madison, but throughout the Midwest. He was first and foremost a city planner, but you can actually, I think of him and the Olmsted brothers in as very much the same way, which is that they were actually really concerned with thinking about how spaces could be designed and used, especially by people who had really technical training and were creative. So they actually did a lot of university campuses as well, because they saw their role as essentially, being able to create the conditions that would make a space thrive. So the fact that they created university campuses, which of course often were segregated institutions themselves, suburbs, which were often segregated, but considered to be ideal places to live for a variety of reasons, as well as parks, which for the enjoyment of the public, shows that I think that John Nolan, the Olmsted brothers, just kind of factored in things like segregation into just one, for them, mundane and unquestioned facet of all the other criteria they evaluated when thinking about people and spaces. And this was one thing that really fascinated me, especially when I looked at restrictive covenants, including Nolan's just crossed out replicated covenant, which was just how much racism was just one additional thing for them. That in order to plan and design and think about space, something to be not to be hidden, but to be worked in as a criteria for what should be a public or private space.
Great. All right. So as we're opening things up for questions, I'd also encourage you to turn on your video camera if you're able to. So we're not just looking at sort of a wall of boxes of names. I think Dr. Glotzer would appreciate sort of seeing your faces too.
And I would love to echo that. I would love for grad students to feel like they can ask some of the first questions. Tiffany?
So I'm not a grad student, so I would definitely want to see the floor.
I think you can probably go ahead. People are still, I think, sort of thinking over things at the moment. So go ahead, feel free to start us off.
Well, thank you for that talk. It was really amazing. I love this kind of stuff. I guess one question I have as a quantitative researcher, do you have some thoughts about how we can better integrate these insights into our work? Because what I see a lot of is people doing research on redlining and other things like that, where we know, well, at least I'm coming to find out that those red line areas don't always map very neatly onto current day areas. How can we kind of integrate these insights into our models and better contextualizing work on structural racism more broadly and segregation in particular?
Thank you. It's a great question. And it's one that I struggle with too. But I would say two areas of quantitative research that might be really helpful is trying to correlate public expenditures with and how they change over time with the sort of racial demographics of a time and place. Now, causality might get a little mixed up in there, right? If you look at something like gentrification, public expenditures drive gentrification as well as then support gentrified neighborhoods. But I would say that looking at things like the sewer system, I was looking through ledgers to kind of understand why this, like exactly how disproportionate city resources were in Roland Park versus, say, the poor neighborhood with 100 petitioners wanting a pipe. I would say sometimes also simple things like counting the people in the room, counting people who say proposals get taken up versus proposals that get rejected, looking at invitations that go out to an event, or looking at investment portfolios, all might provide some numerical data. Also just in terms of things like when I wanted to trace influence, I was really fascinated by the way something like restrictive covenants were worked into university curricula. So I tried to find, okay, well, how many students every semester, and then did they become city planners? Where did they go? What were their teams like? So trying to kind of figure out where people went, in what numbers and in what concentrations, was part of the way that I was trying to figure out how to turn the act of tracing and following into kind of statements about how a place changed over time. So I think those would be some of the things. I also just, when I was looking at the investments, the British investors, I also was just looking at the amount of capital that they invested. What did it mean? And I tried to find social meaning from that. What did it mean for, say, like a widow to invest £1 in, maybe her only investment in like a land company that was then going to maybe give a safe return because it was tied to colonialism or westward expansion. So I tried to figure out things like, well, what was sort of, like the average demographic profile of someone who invested £1? What work can we do with investors, and what work can we do with investment money in terms of how it shapes cities? I think can maybe be a really promising source as well of data for models too.
This is amazing. I mean, does somebody else have a question? Because I had a follow-up. Sorry, I don't want to
go ahead, Tiffany.
Okay, so I'm just thinking about Werner Troskin's work, the late economic historian who looked at how, some areas where white people couldn't exclude Black people from the benefits of improved sewage systems, you saw disproportionate improvements in mortality pre-civil rights era. So I'm just trying to think about how maybe the construction of cities and the way segregation was very different than we think about might affect the models we're constructing. Sorry if that's not clear.
It's clear. I mean, I think that looking at, I think the way people have framed the racial wealth gap, I think is a really interesting kind of approach to looking at how inequality does seem to be, and by many measures, growing in recent decades, despite, seemingly on the books more laws that should be potentially ostensibly outlawing different types of segregation. So I do think that one thing, especially in Baltimore, people are looking at like special use zones, like TIPs, special financial instruments that are supposed to essentially have a little bit of an equity mission to them, but seem to always get used to build stadiums and luxury condos instead. Though I think that kind of, and I'm thinking of also, there was a recent story that came out where also welfare agencies have been using money or have been essentially doling out some money to developers to build all sorts of projects that then have no return in actual terms of equity. So I think that then where is agency money going? What is the mission that is taught? Like, how are people essentially bending the mission of agencies to redistribute money amongst public and private sectors might be really useful for seeing why, for instance, if there is a law with a certain intent, it doesn't seem to actually fulfill that intent. I think that might be something. I could be a little more concrete with that and potentially think of, I could certainly follow up with you about some of the stuff that I've been reading about especially on TIPS. It might be an interesting kind of area to plumb.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. This is really fascinating work.
Thank you. Alex?
Hi, Paige. Thank you for this. I had to step in and out, so if you talked about this while I was stepped out, I do apologize. I'm currently writing a PAA abstract and racking my brain about how to talk about or not talk about causality when it comes to segregation, and it is really frustrating because it is both a cause and consequence, and there's time variance there, right? So sometimes it's a cause, sometimes it's a consequence, and it depends on your question, and the language gets murky really quickly. And I'm wondering if you have some information about how you think about the role of distant history versus kind of more proximate history in the organizing of space and ratio-spatial space. Because it I think I have a handle on it and then I lose it when I'm writing, and then I think I get a handle and then I lose it. And so this role of distant history, like we're thinking about redlining and restrictive covenants that kind of set the stage for how racial space is organized. And then there are more immediate or proximate things that also set the stage, but then began to be self-reinforcing. And how do we talk about where segregation is going without using causal language, or should we be using causal language in that? I know that's a big question, and for segregation researchers, I think struggle with it, but.
Yeah, I'm going to actually actually start off by just recommending 2 books that I think are, for me, are really good examples that could maybe speak to working through some of the things you are working through. One is called Race for Profit by Keeanga Yamada Taylor. Because I think that the thorny issues of causality in issues around affordable housing and especially the treatment of Black women are she just uncovered some amazing things, but also the way she talks about them. I think that she does such a great job with these questions of causality. So I would say that that's a wonderful model. And then in terms of this question of longer history, one of the things I love being a historian, and people who know historians are always like, God, historians are always like, well, as a historian. I will say that one of the things I love is that there's not necessarily a linear way in which things that are more proximate maybe are more influential, or things that are less proximate. For example, even just thinking about the role of like cultural tourism, the idea of spinning narratives and stories about kind of the imagined history of a place has all sorts of consequences for marketing that place, or again, marshaling resources, right? And also, I think that thinking about history, something I didn't get a chance to emphasize in the talk is thinking about continued presence of people who, regardless of things like redlining, of land theft, of dispossession, right? Even if I didn't get to groups in this talk, continued presence always puts a kind of spanner in the works for neat, easy histories about, well, this is the cause, and this is the cause, and this is the cause. And to that sense, I would, one thing that I'm really careful to try and do, especially when talking about old versus new, is I don't have as many places in my work where I talk about, say, Native Americans as I should have, like straight up. And when I was reading the book Native Seattle, which is my second book recommendation for you, Native Seattle, by, I believe, Colm Thresh. Native, let me look it up real quick. Yes, Cole Thresh. Native Seattle is absolutely incredible for, I think, taking these questions of distant versus presence and completely spinning them on his head, and instead looking at the continuities, especially what it means to be continually visible, continually present, despite any attempt to erase or silence people, and how that then translates to shaping spaces. So I would say that would be the way to go. Think about the continuities, especially continued presence of people, and all of the ways that can afford you moments, big and small, to actually see who is acting and how in a space that impacts that space, regardless of what a dominant narrative or even your archival sources may be.
Great. Well, I think we're actually right at about 1:30 already. This was a really fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it today. And Dr. Glotzer will be back on campus in the not too distant future. So I'm sure she would be willing to sort of field any future questions you have as it pops up in research related to these things. I also wanted to sort of give an announcement for DemSem for next week. So we're actually doing double duty where our speaker, Tam Kennett-Ralph, is actually giving a job talk in sociology in our time space. She's going to be presenting work on sort of well-being and inequality in the United States. And so very much sort of within sort of our general DemSem wheelhouse that's here. So I look forward to sort of seeing most of you back there, but we'll probably also have an expanded audience in person back up on the 8th floor, because we'll have more people from the broader sociology community will be joining us than usual. So with that, thanks again for a great talk, and we'll see the rest of you next week. Bye, everybody.